So thank you for the presentation, Aniba. It's really, I guess, it made way for me to be able to talk about some of the things I will talk about, and hopefully me to skip over some of the things because you really touched on the meat of the whole conversation. Or that I was invited for this, I started thinking about what should I talk about or how can I frame it? And thanks so much. Before I concluded that this topic or the title is best suited for my contribution due to the way that artisanal fisheries sector, or should I say the fishing communities in the countries that I have worked with, many of which are in West and Central Africa, how they have been treated and continue to be treated. And so I decided on the title, Everything About Us, Without Us. And I hope that by the end of this presentation, we will make better sense of why I have chosen this topic and why we should change this narrative. So the outline of my presentation, I will first of all talk about the importance of marine fisheries, the coastal livelihood on the African continent, look at the threats to sustaining these contributions, and look at government responses to this stress. And by government, I also mean global and local and regional governments. And then we'll look at the implications of these responses to coastal livelihoods. Local communities are responding to those implications. And the emphasis is going to be on the extreme cases in terms of the extreme responses, because it is almost always these extreme responses that have the potential to then attract government's attention, that unfortunately leads to this cycle of securitization of the ocean that we're seeing, which have even further implication on artisanal fishing and their livelihoods. And then finally, we will look at what can be done differently and exploring ways to change this narrative around everything about us without us, nothing about us without us. So first, like Moniba noted in her presentation, fish is a very important source of food for Africans, contributing to the food security of over 200 million Africans. And looking at it from the perspective of the contribution to the animal protein, depending on the country and where, in terms of the coastal community that we're looking at, it contributes up to 40 to 80 and sometimes 85% of the animal protein consumed by coastal states and coastal communities. And sometimes it's actually the only source of animal protein that is consumed by coastal communities. So it's actually a very important source of food. And if you want to link it to the SDGs, you find that fisheries then is important for SDG 1 and 2, putting an end to hunger and putting an end to poverty. In terms of livelihood contributions, there's a lot of data that sort of points to fisheries at the continental level contributing to the livelihoods of up to 10 million people and sometimes up to 19 million people on the African continent. But at the same time, it feels that this is conservative, especially if you take into account, for instance, that in Nigeria alone, according to a 2018 publication by World Fish, fish contributes, I think, an estimated 8.6 million, contributes to the livelihood of, directly to the livelihood of 8.6 million Nigerians, and indirectly in terms of those that work in the processing sector and also the trade, about 19.6 million people. And 40% of those people in the post-harvest sector, that is after the fish has been produced or caught at sea, are women. And so this also then gives you an idea, again, going back to the SDGs, the contribution that fish potentially can make, or the fishery sector potentially can make to ending inequality in line with SDG 10, for example, and also the role that it can play in improving gender equality in relation to SDG 5. An important thing that I'd like to note at this point as well is that although when we talk about fisheries, especially in the artisanal sector, we talk about men dominate the fishing activity itself, but also women and the role that they play is very important in that in West African countries, especially, women finance the fishing activities of men. In a lot of countries and a lot of communities as such, you could see that without the important contribution that women play as financiers, the fishing activities by men might actually never happen. And so you see that there is this cyclical positive relationship between the men and the women and how their activities complement each other and how it then supports their home lives, you know, being able to then provide food for their families and being able to pay for school fees for their children. In terms of the economic contribution, because this is also something that is driving government's decision around, you know, how or whether or not to sign fisheries agreement with distant water fishing nation or licensed vessels from distant water fishing nations to fish in their waters. So according to the World Bank, the economic contribution from fisheries is estimated at 24 billion each year to the African economy, and this figure can go higher depending on certain improvements being implemented by different states. And aligning the point that Moniba made in terms of the contribution of the artisanal sector to fisheries production. In West Africa, for instance, especially looking at countries within the Fisheries Committee for West Central Gulf of Guinea, which includes Benin Republic, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, Liberia, Togo, and Nigeria. 70% of the fisheries production is by the artisanal fishing sector, which is about 200,000 canoes. And this is actually something that goes back and feeding the people within those countries. And I'd like to finalize the importance of fisheries to livelihoods of coastal communities by restating what was said to me by a fisher folk from the Bonny Island in the Niger Delta when I was trying to understand the importance of fishing. You know, why do you continue to fish despite the so many challenges that you've been talking about? And he noted that he's still in fishing because fishing is a chain empowerment scheme. So it's no longer about him. It is about him, the fisher, and then the fishmonger that relies on the fish that he catches, and the processor that relies on the fishmonger, or the processor that also relies directly on him, and then the distributor, the unloaders. And so him as a single person would at the end of the day be empowering directly and indirectly 16 other people, of which if he's no longer able to continue to fish, there are 15 other people and then their families that are directly and indirectly affected by the decision for him to not fish or whenever he's not able to catch enough fish. So I thought this is something that needs to be highlighted. Similarly, in Guinea, has been noted that for every 3.5 for every fishing job done by a fisherman, an additional 3.5 offshore jobs are created. And then finally, trying to highlight the important contribution that women make in the fisheries sector is also to know that in West Africa, about 80% of seafood in the region is marketed by women. So women are literally the bridge between the producers and the consumers, of which if they are not present, the consumers will also find it more difficult for them to have access to fish, which is important for their food safety and also for their animal protein. However, the ability of fisheries to continue to contribute to all these important things we've talked about earlier is essentially threatened by so many factors, including but not limited to marine pollution, including oil pollution. So for instance, oil production started in 1958. About 40% of the mangrove vegetation have been oiled. The implication of this is, of course, that about 60% of the marine species in the Gulf of Guinea breed in the mangrove of Niger Delta, of which oil pollution undermines the ability of this different species to be able to continue to breed. And if you go to the Niger Delta today, fishing activity is actually no longer viable. The extent of oil pollution in those areas, in a lot of the communities. And then there's also the threat of toxic waste dumping, a lot of which is done illegally. So it's not just about, disposing toxic waste indiscriminately, but a lot of them is done without the knowledge of a lot of governments and the high seas of the waters of different countries in West and Central Africa, which then further exacerbate the threat to fisheries depletion. There's also pollution from the shipping sector, of which limited capability by coastal states to monitor, survey, and control what happens offshore their waters have meant that this can happen without any implication on the actors, with the impact, of course, being that it exacerbates the depletion of fish stock. There's also the threat of overfishing in that, despite the fact that certain species are already depleted, countries continue to license vessels from distant water nations to target the species that are already depleted, overexploited, or significantly threatened, especially tuna species, for instance, or Sardinella, and other species like Bonga in West Africa. There's also the threat from legal fishing. When I say legal fishing, resulting from not only, and I think it's also important to note it at this point, but not only from the relationship or the business relationship between, the business arrangement between governments and vessels, but also resulting from activities of artisanal fishers. And I will sort of explain why I'm highlighting this, because it is also resulting in certain action by the states in trying to address this problem, but indirectly having a negative impact on artisanal fishers. There's also the impact of then illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, but primarily illegal and unreported fishing that is exacerbating depletion in a way that undermines the livelihood of artisanal fishers. And this illegal fishing is mainly by vessels that might already have legal authorization to exploit fishery species in a particular country, but then abusing the terms of that agreement by maybe fishing in inshore areas, or using the opportunities, the fact that they're already there to encroach in waters of neighboring countries. So for instance, distant water vessels that have an agreement or fishing license to Sao Tome and Principe, for example, going into Nigeria and EEZ, where they do not have any such arrangement to then fish illegally. These are just some of the ways that undermine livelihoods of sustainability of the livelihoods of the people that rely on fisheries for their livelihood. We also then have the impact, which unfortunately is going to affect the countries in West Africa severely unless fisheries governance is improved. So for instance, there's been research that has been done, and the one that I'll be citing is from the World Bank, I believe from 2017, noted that unless fisheries governance is improved, and if the temperature continues to rise by 2050, fisheries production in countries like Nigeria, Ghana, and Cote d'Ivoire would reduce by over 50%. And of course, this is very problematic, especially when you take into account that there are already research that exists, primarily from 2016, for example, by Daniels et al., that noted that the fisheries species in the waters between Nigeria and Senegal have depleted by up to 50%. So if we should go by the statistics, and whilst also taking into account that data remains a problem when it comes to fisheries, then you know that this is absolutely a very big problem, especially when there are other factors that continue to, threaten the sustainability of fish stock. And then when you talk about the BE and blue acceleration, some of the point that has already been made by Oniba Isaac, the problem is that now when you talk about the blue economy, the African continent sees the ocean for African development. There's actually this aspiration that the ocean economy is going to contribute to this vision of the Africa we want, and there's nothing wrong with that. The problem, however, is that so many coastal states are all of a sudden interested in tapping into or harnessing the potential from the ocean economy without necessarily thinking about how might one action be affecting the other. So you see that there is this quest for further offshore oil exploration. We're seeing a country like Senegal and Mauritania that are actually going to become, if they've not already become, a significant oil producer. And we're seeing countries that are already producing oil doing further exploration, like Ghana finding more oil wells, and even Nigeria finding more on the offshore. The problem with this, however, is that with every exploration contract, there is unfortunately areas that have to be completely reserved for either infrastructure or for the exploration. And with all this action means that areas are taken off from traditional fisheries to ensure that this happens. We also have the effect of BE that is resulting from port infrastructure expansion. In Cote d'Ivoire, for example, we had the expansion of the Brie Lagoon. In Cameroon, we had the port infrastructure built in Kribi. In Nigeria, we have the Lekki port that has been built. The implication again is that traditional fishers lose their traditional fishing grounds to make way to these things without necessarily having any conversation with them around the potential compensation. How can they be supported to maybe other supplementary source of livelihood as these factors further reduce their ability to continue to make ends meet. We also have the threat of pirates and armed at sea, which unfortunately the fisher folk to threats to their personal security, but also to their livelihood, in that the more this incident increases, the more they are less likely not to go to sea because they don't want to fall victim. And in the Niger Delta area, for instance, when you talk about armed robbery at sea, fisher folk have fallen victim in that their boats are taken and their engine stolen from them because the pirates use it to do other things that helps them power the engines they use for their piracy activity. And then there's also then actions that are being taken to mitigate the impact of climate change. And Moniba talked about 30 by 30. We also see increasingly countries making decisions around conserving the oceans, which again takes from the fishers who already have lost their source of livelihood, are continuing to lose their source of livelihood because of the impact of depleting fisheries. And so how are governments responding to some of these issues or threats that I've talked about? And then it also helps us to begin to think about how might these further actions be affecting coastal communities and fisher folk. So we see the responses in the name of either trying to make more money in the form of reducing the inshore fishing area. So in Sierra Leone, which seemed quite illogical, there was discussion around reducing the inshore area for artisanal fishers, which is counterproductive, especially when you think about the fact that what is actually needed is ensuring sustainability and reducing inshore areas and then giving access to more access seems to be counterproductive. But this also then speaks to the whole idea that artisanal fishers are seen as small people and therefore their views do not necessarily count. And see in the spirit or in the name of conserving the ocean's resources, governments are introducing closed seasons, and closed season is basically an idea of saying that we're not going to fish for 1 month to allow for regeneration. So in a country like Ghana, for instance, for the last 3 years, they have had closed seasons for 2 years for artisan, for 2 months in a year for industrial vessels, and then 1 month for artisanal vessels. The problem with this, of course, is that in this 1 month period, they do not have any other source of livelihood. They do not have any alternative. And not just about not having the alternative, it is also about the way that the conversation around this policy have been instituted, the extent to which they have been consulted and their views sought has been something that is very problematic. It becomes a case of we have made this decision and we are imposing this decision. This is, of course, very problematic, especially when you take into account that because of the progress that Ghana have made with this, other West African countries are now following suit. So, for instance, Cote d'Ivoire will be introducing their first closed season this year in July, and Togo and Benin Republic are also having conversations around introducing something like this. despite the fact that there's been a very huge condemnation around the implementation in Ghana. And then we're also seeing broader conversation around the introduction of marine protected areas because, well, climate change, and because, well, the ocean needs to be conserved, without really giving a thought to how might all this actions you're taking further be pushing people that are already vulnerable into further vulnerability and exposing them to threats that they do not have any control over. In order to address the threat of piracy and robbery at sea, we're seeing countries, especially Central Africa, restricting activities in certain areas, for instance, in the harbor, because they feel that, okay, to address the issue of armed robbery at sea, we need to restrict activities of certain people. And it happens to be fisher folk that are often suspected as criminal when they're going about their normal business. And sometimes they are shot at as part of this securitization of the oceans in the name of addressing threats such as piracy and robbery at sea. We also see reduction in fishing times, again, by based on efforts by coastal government to address the threat of piracy. So, for instance, if people were to use the harbor from morning to 6 p.m., now a reduction that they are no longer able to use it after 4 p.m. because the assumption is if it's dark, there's more likely for criminal activities to happen. So even though legitimately these are policies that are aimed at addressing one thing, it unfortunately undermines the ability of fisherfolk to continue to make ends meet in a way that they are used to, because one, they are not consulted, and an alternative solution is not provided to them. So what is the implication of all these things that we've talked about? The most visible implication is reduced catch, because with all those threats and with all these policies and with all these actions, the fisher folks are no longer able to catch enough to make ends meet. They're not even able to catch enough to support their families. A report that was written by the World Bank in 2017 noted that as of 2016, in the last decade, that the income of fisher folk in West Africa have reduced by up to 40%. And so if this is talking about 2016, how much more would this income have reduced to this point, especially when we take into account that the impact of climate change is actually exacerbating at a rate that was not the case 10 years ago. And the overall implication, of course, is poverty. If people cannot catch enough fish to be able to make ends meet, they are poor, they are pushed further into poverty, and without any kind of support from their government or from the state, they become very desperate, and I would say it becomes hopeless prey in the hands of criminal network. Although this is not always the case, and although there are people, thousands of people that would still continue to manage, and I see and engage with them, fisher folk that are still continuing to manage and hoping against hope that things would improve. But what we also see is that in extreme cases, the first thing that fisher folk would do, or fishers primarily would do, is engage in illegal fishing themselves. So they fish in areas that are passed as off limits to them, for instance, close to oil pipelines, and which of course also exposes them to threatening their own personal securities, because if the boat makes contact with the pipeline, there's likely to be oil leakages, or there might even be an accident which would result in fire, and they might lose their life. There's also increased risk of violent attack against perpetrating vessels. When I say perpetrating vessels, I mean of illegal fishing. So there's been a lot of conflict between artisanal fishers and industrial vessels that are encroaching areas that is made for the artisanal vessels. And we see in a country like Sierra Leone, for example, is quite well documented that artisanal vessels have clashed with industrial vessels that are engaging with in illegal fishing, especially Chinese vessels that have engaged in illegal fishing. And then we also have, unfortunately, drugs trafficking and human trafficking, wherein artisanal fishers use their boats to traffic drugs, especially in West Africa, quite common in the case of marijuana, or acting as informant and taking their children off school because, well, they can no longer afford to pay their school fees. And what we have seen, especially with the girl child, is increase in teenage pregnancies. We're seeing increase in sex for fish, sex for money, sex for finance. And with that, you have the prevalence of HIV and the potential of the prevalence of HIV becomes a problem. I'm trying to go to my last slide, but it doesn't seem to be responding. Sorry. Okay. Yeah. So what can we do differently? And this is basically restating what the artisanal fisheries have said at the end of the International Year of Artisanal Fisheries and Aquaculture, and without necessarily having to retell or recount what has to be done differently based on the research that I have done. What is clear to me with my engagement with artisanal fishers in different countries that I've worked in is that nobody knows the solution to a problem other than the person that is experiencing this problem. And therefore, trying to propose solution at an international level, at a national, regional level, without actually engaging the people this solution you're proposing are likely to have an impact on is going to be counterproductive. And importantly, there's a need for governments on the African continent and at the global level to rethink and redirect some of the solutions or some of the practices that they're currently applying when it comes to maritime security in West Africa, and support artisanal fishers more by exploring the ideas within the FAO voluntary guidelines. Thank you so much for listening, and I'm so sorry for taking so much of your time.
No, Ife, thank you. That is actually really wonderful, and I think just the way that you're drawing together those really diverse justice issues and how they all kind of intersect. I'm really grateful. That's